There we go. Anything in positive religion that exceeded the moral law were really superfluous, right? This was the typical Enlightenment thought. But Kant wants to say, no, there is value. There's philosophical and practical value in positive historical religions, but they need to be limited and constrained by the religion of reason. Okay, that's the project of the religion within the limits. Okay, or within the bounds. Right. So that's the first thing I want you to keep in mind as you read through. The second thing is to keep in mind what he does with the following things. One is the notion, there's three concepts. The notion of radical evil. Okay. He does this in book 1 or part 1, right? And this really sort of frames the whole book of discussion in the entire text. So radical evil. Secondly, the role of the religious community. And what he wants to do is to give it a role in helping us to follow the religion of reason, that is to say the moral law. He wants to give them a positive role to the community. And so try to figure out how he's doing that. The third thing is the notion of grace. Now Kant's going to talk about, look, I can put that up. Okay, never mind, I can't. Kant's going to talk about grace. He's going to give it a philosophical gloss. And it will not be the same kind of discussions of grace that you will see in someone like Augustine, for example, really, or many other theologians, but Kant's going to give it a philosophical gloss. So keep in mind those three concepts, okay, as you're reading through the religion. Now, if I can get this guy going, we'll start our contextualizing bit. I didn't hear a little bloopity bloop thing, but maybe now.
Please stop using such technical language with us.
Aha, it works.
Still learning.
It is kind of what it sounds like a little bit.
It is, no, very much so.
Okay, so just a little bit of background. In England, philosophers took a pretty strongly empiricist approach to philosophy, and we saw this in David Hume. And this resulted, in terms of their views of religion, in quite a lot of skepticism. Doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't theologians, etc. in England. Of course there were, but from the point of view of philosophers, resulted in quite a bit of skepticism. In France, this skepticism is accompanied by a passionate anti-clericalism, right? Now, remember Kant's dates are 1724 to 1804, and the French Revolution happens right in 1700, right? So you get a good deal of anti-clericalism in France. In Germany, though, the influence of pietism prevented the kind of anti-clerical sentiments that you can see in England or France. And maybe more important for us, conceptual thought was given precedent in Germany over sensation, right? Sensation or sense experience. So idealism prevails in Germany over skepticism. And of course, the most obvious idealist is going to be Hegel, right? It's going to be Hegel. And for those of you who are more interested in the history of Christian thought, remember that Kant and Goethe and Jacobi, Herder, Schleiermacher, all of them were raised in the German pietist tradition, right? They're all raised in the German pietist tradition. Now, with respect to idealism, Troeltsch attributes this victory for idealism to the influence of Leibniz. Do you guys remember who Leibniz is? This has to be the best of all possible worlds, right? Best of all possible worlds. to which he was subjected to a parody in Voltaire's famous novel Candide, which is actually really still pretty funny. And Leibniz's influence mean that for Leibniz really sort of substitutes teleology for mechanics, right? He believes in final causes, that is to say, in nature there are still final causes. God sets the world up with the sense of purpose. Final causes result is a way of talking about purposes. Okay, sets the world up with respect to purposes, and the mechanics of nature, all the operations of nature, all follow a purpose which is eventually leading to God's overall purpose. And this gave a religious tone to much of philosophy in Germany. Now, Rousseau also had a profound effect on the German Enlightenment. He's usually considered a deist. Everybody know it? We were talking about deism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a God, but like, let's not get crazy here.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's very good. That's very good. Right. God sets it up, and then kicks back, pops open a beer, and just watches us all ruin ourselves. It's pretty funny. So he's usually considered a deist, Rousseau that is, but he also has an abiding interest in the passions. And for Rousseau thinks of morality not as the suppression of instinct by reason, but instead as the growth and maturity of the passions, right? The growth and maturity of the passions. And he wrote a famous book on education, the moral education, is the education of the passions. It's called Emile. Some of you might have read Emile or heard of it. Now, there are two important features of, well, first of all, let me just say, Kant is going to disagree with Rousseau in this way. For Kant, this is not what we're talking about with moral education, okay? The influence of the German Enlightenment has really two features that are important in terms of their impact on religious thought, okay? First is the adoption of the historical critical method, which they adopt from England. And by the way, some of you probably know that the development of the modern discipline of history and historiography comes right out of the development of historical critical method in biblical studies, right, in biblical studies. We're not going to look at that one really, but we will look at the second one, systems of rational theism. So the most fashionable way to characterize the effects of the Enlightenment is that in England it issues in skepticism, in France it issues in anti-clericalism, and in Germany it issues in idealism and rational theism and natural theology, right? Natural theology, right? Which Bart hates, but what are you going to do? And by the way, when we talk about anti-clericalism in this period, it's really sort of just a resentment or maybe resentment's not the right word. It's really sort of being against clergy, right, and the clerical establishment. When we talk about clericalism now, especially in the Catholic Church, we mean something a little bit different. We mean kind of the abuse of clerical authority. Okay. Now in Germany, the pace setter and all this is. Yeah, right.
Run pipe. Please continue.
Yeah, the pace setter in all this in Germany is this dude named Christian Wolff, right? Wolff. No relation to Wolf Blitzer. Totally different, right?
People aren't usually just last name to first name. Anyway, yeah, that's fine.
Who would name the kid Wolf, by the way? Like, I don't know, maybe it'll be intimidating. We name him Wolf. Anyway. So Wolff is a pupil of Leibniz, right? But he dissents in some respects, especially in terms of Leibniz's doctrine of the monads. He is exiled from Prussia for a while, but Frederick the Great recalls him in the 1740s, and Wolff teaches until he dies in the 1750s. And what he tries to do is to synthesize Leibniz and the medieval scholastics. And in doing this, he produces the outstanding systematic philosophy in Germany in the 18th century. Now, Wolff's point of entry into philosophy was mathematics, and he was a professor of mathematics. And from Leibniz, he took there to be only two universal maxims, right? Two universal maxims. First, the principle of identity, right? So two substances cannot be identical in cannot be identical in substance and differ only in number, right? You know what I mean when I say differ only in number? It just means that there's one of you and there's another of you, and in all other respects except that there's another one, right? You're totally identical. He says that can't happen, right?
Don't you read about it? That's Wolfie.
Oh, it's Wolff. Yes, that's right. That's right. Even a doppelganger, right? Can't be identical in all respects except number. Secondly, the principle of sufficient reason. That is, there must be a sufficient reason for contingent truths, right? Not necessary truths, but contingent truths, or truths of material fact. Okay. So that's what he gets from Leibniz. His natural theology this should be italicized. Sorry about that. Comes out in 2 volumes in 1736 and 37. It gives a strictly mechanistic understanding of nature, but still he says that nature can't be self-explanatory. So God must have made the machine with a purpose, right? With a purpose. So he gets that from Leibniz too. So mechanics and teleology are not antithetical. And he argues that God's existence can be proved, right? So he's persuaded by the ontological argument, that most beautiful of logical arguments, and also the cosmological argument for God's existence. But he says God's existence is the only thing that reason can show about God, right? Reason cannot show anything else except that God exists for Leibniz, okay? Now, the pietists in Germany, they don't really like this guy Wolff very much, right? They don't like reason supplanting faith, right? And they didn't like his view that education was adequate to bring about the moral life, right? So the pietists, not wild about Wolff. But for Wolff, the world proceeds in typical deist fashion, according to laws set up by God at the creation of the universe. And then God remains really outside of the world, right? Outside of the world. God does not intervene. It's a typical deist position. And like any machine, the world must have some function to perform, some purpose that's given to it by its maker. And for Wolff, that's the task of the theologian, right? Is to tell us just what that function is. And this is the mindset that Kant learns from his own teacher, Knudsen, right? So in one sense, Kant's theological horizon was quite limited. I didn't really mention this, but you know, Kant was born in this town called Königsberg, lives there his whole life, never gets married.
That's not really all that much of a shock.
Well, I can think of a couple people that might have liked married, but maybe not. He lives there all his life. He never even leaves. He never even leaves to go anywhere else. Doesn't travel at all, right? But he does talk about some atrocities that were committed in North America, which he apparently read about. But yeah, he doesn't really leave. His theological horizon was quite limited. By the way, so Königsberg is now called Kaliningrad, right? Now it's Kaliningrad. And if you look that up on a map, it's sort of a weird place. It's basically surrounded by Lithuania and Poland, but it's a province of Russia, right? Sort of odd, and it's not continuous with any part of Russia at all, but it's on the coast of the Black Sea. it's the natural theology of Wolff, right? Christian Wolff and the Wolffian tradition that Kant has in mind when he speaks about the illusion of metaphysics, right? He talks about this quite a bit. But still, Kant's concept of God is that of a rational theist, and he's going to criticize that concept in the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. Okay. Now, Kant, and especially his essay, What is Enlightenment?, was the culmination of the 18th century age of reason. And it's encapsulated in his famous cry, Simpere Aude, have the courage to use your own reason. So the Enlightenment for Kant is humanity's self-incurred release from tutelage. That is to say, tutelage. Yeah. That's a good term.
That's a good word.
Yeah. Try to use that 2 or 3 times in the coming week at lunch or something. Yeah, just when I get released from my tutelage.
You will release me from my tutelage.
That's right. So, yeah.
Wow.
Kant thinks that, we've just been doing and thinking what the tradition has been telling us to do and think, but Kant says, no, modern persons have to do our own thinking. It's easy, he says, not to grow up, to surrender our reason to others and let them do the tiresome work of reason for us. It's easy to accept the cleric's admonition, don't think, just believe, right? And don't question. Kant believes that no age has the right to bind a succeeding age by declaring unchanging creeds.
All right. How about that?
Except for that unchanging creed, that no age has that's an unchanging creed. No age
Except
has the
for
right to.
my unchanging creed.
Yeah.
No other unchanging creeds are okay.
Right.
Except in this little house that he never left.
That's right, good point.
A person, he says, of the 18th century is a modern person and has both the duty and the privilege to do her own thinking. Kant also inaugurates the age of German idealism with his Critique of Pure Reason. This is not without antecedents, right? But it does mark the high water point in modern philosophy's turn to the subject. And you could see the turn, hopefully you could see this turn to the subject in Descartes' Meditations, right? The Meditations that we read, okay? But Kant's is really the high part. In both Descartes and Kant, modern philosophy turns in upon itself and contemplates its own processes of cognition, right? It contemplates its own processes of thinking, okay? But what makes Kant different from those that came before him is that with Kant, the mind doesn't adapt itself to objects, right? It's not a ball of wax on which objects impress themselves, like that was Hume's metaphor. Or as Locke says, Locke says it's not that your mind is like a piece of white paper and objects just impress themselves on your mind. Kant says, no, objects conform themselves to the mind. Objects conform, yeah, they do. They conform themselves to the mind, right? And Kant describes this in the Critique of Pure Reason. And in the critique, Kant sets very strict limits on human knowing. And when he's criticizing natural theology, what he's criticizing is the attempts to transgress these limits that he has set out. Yeah.
Yeah. So going back to like day one of this class, with
Yep.
the spectrum of the hermeneutic to the metaphysic,
Yep,
and I remember you saying that the hermeneutics really like Kant because Kant is having this limitation on what our perception is able to do
Yes.
and things filtering.
They may not like all aspects of Kant,
Right.
but these limitations on knowing, they certainly do.
Yeah.
Limitations on metaphysics for sure.
So I guess and I guess we talked a little, or at least you and I talked a little bit about this, but doesn't Kant undermine his own work from a hermeneutic perspective by declaring a categorical imperative.
Yeah.
Physic.
Right,
almost.
right. Yes. There is a critique of Kant's notion of the categorical imperative based on his idea of freedom, and freedom being a noumena. I think we tried to touch on that last semester a little bit, right? If you remember that. There is definitely a critique of Kant, and Kant probably does undermine his own argument for the categorical imperative in just that way.
Yeah, it just sort of feels like he's going along and he's like, you know, not perspective, that feels like an oversimplification, but like our perception,
Mm-hmm.
and this overarching universal thing.
Which is the categorical
Which is the
imperative.
categorical
Yes,
imperative.
that's right.
So he sort of like makes a radical departure from everything
Yeah.
leading up to that moment.
Well, yeah, except his answer is going to be, we'll sort of see this in a minute, his answer is going to be, well, it's going to still remain a postulate. You know, it's going to remain a postulate. Now, you can ask the same question about his understanding of freedom, right? The point is, he seems to treat freedom and the categorical imperative as noumena, even though he's said in the first critique that you can't know noumena. All you can know is phenomena, right? And that's what we missed in the first class. Okay. Okay, so Kant, as we said, was trained early on in a deeply pietist school. His mother was a devout pietist. His family was Lutheran. He was born, as we mentioned, in Königsberg, and he lived his whole life there. Educated at the University of Königsberg, which had a deeply pietistic background. But by the time Kant got there, it had been thoroughly infused by the Wolffian stream of rational theism. Right? He spent nine years there as a private tutor, which basically meant he was not paid by the university. He had to get his own, round up his own business. The next 15 years, he was turned down twice for professorships.
That sucks, and he had to like get his own people together, and then he was turned down.
Yeah, that's right. And
That's hard.
He was a privat docent, which is sort of like a lecturer, but like they did not get paid, so he would give classes and have students pay him to come for each class, right? Sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't, but it wasn't until 1770 that he's finally made a professor of logic and mathematics, right? And one of the things that brings me a little bit of, one of the reasons I like Kant is because none of history's geniuses made their reputations later in life than Kant. Except potentially. Right? Nobody remembers or reads the stuff he wrote when he was younger. It's not until the first critique, when he's like 60 years old, right? So yeah, I like that. When he was 43, he made the famous comment that metaphysics is a mistress whose favors are sparse, right?
Did he say it just like that?
Yeah, he said it exactly like that. Yeah, there's a.
Is that what that baby's saying?
Yeah. I think this baby looks a little bit like Yoda, except for the ears and stuff. When he published the first critique, he claimed that there was no subject in metaphysics that he had not solved,
That's great.
or at least provided the key. Right?
You did it.
Yeah, pretty audacious claim, right?
Yeah.
That's
That's
what
pretty
he was
cool.
doing for
None
60
of you
years.
guys.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, okay, I've got it now. Now, until the death of Frederick the Great, which, as you all know, he died in 1786.
Yes.
Yeah. The University of Königsberg enjoyed wide freedom of thought and expression. And under Frederick the Great, there was significant religious toleration throughout Prussia, right? Throughout Prussia. By the way, Prussia was like a huge place. It covered not just Germany, as we mostly think of it now, but also lots of Poland and lots of Eastern Europe. Yeah.
Who knows Frederick? I'm getting a whole history lesson right now.
Who's Frederick the Great?
Yes.
Well, he was just like the emperor of
Okay.
Prussia.
Prussia is
Germany
like half the world.
Yeah, Germany plus a whole bunch more.
Strangely enough, no Prussia, I just don't know like who that person is.
Yeah, that's the, I mean, there was, well then, there was Frederick II. Yeah, you probably get those things confused.
Freddie.
Yeah. Not Freddie the freeholder, but Frederick II. Now, under Frederick II, who was Frederick the Great's successor? Would it be a bummer to come after somebody named the Great?
Yeah.
Anyway, Frederick II. This dude wants to promote a big religious revival, right? A revival. But he took this to be inconsistent with the kind of toleration that his predecessor had permitted. So he was much less tolerant. In fact, he enforces a system of state censorship, right? A system of state censorship, like some people want to do in the U.S. now, who will remain nameless. And so when Kant presented the first part of his religion within the limits or within the bounds to the state censor, they wouldn't let him publish it. They wouldn't let him publish it. But he got around this somehow, it's not exactly clear to me, by having it published not by the theology faculty, but by the philosophy faculty at Königsberg. And this caused some deal of consternation with Frederick II, and Frederick II summoned Kant to appear before him and give an account of his life and work. Right? Now, can you imagine if you publish a book now and Biden sends you a letter, I need you to come to my office on account of this book and give an account of your life and work, but that's what happened. And Kant told Frederick II that he was really trying to promote religion. And I think you can sort of see that if you view Kant in context, right? He's really trying to promote religion, and that he really wouldn't publish anything else that the censor rejected, right? And of course, this has led to some debate about certain of Kant's positions within the religion, within the limits or within the bounds. Do they really represent Kant's thought, or is he massaging them in a way to please the censor, right? There's been some debate about some things like this. Okay, now Kant, religious thought alienates him from much of the Protestant world. And not only because of his style, and especially the world of Lutheran pietism, right? The pietists had no use for Kant, and for the last 40 years of his life, he did not attend any worship service. But still, at least according to some people, he did maintain a devout sense of religion. Okay, maybe he's one of these sort of precursors to the people who are religious but not, or what, spiritual but not religious, right? Now, in a private letter, Kant made the famous statement that his work. Wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have done that. Oh no, I'm sorry. I just got ahead of myself. Yeah. So, in the Religion Within the Limits, he says he's trying to save religion from a purely negative rationalism, right? From a purely negative rationalism, and by ridding theology of proofs, he says he's making room for faith. You can't prove God. You can have faith in God, right? Because if you can, I don't have to have faith in the Pythagorean theorem, right? I mean, it just works, right? We've got a proof that it works. I don't need any faith for that. And in a private letter, Kant makes the famous statement that his work had been concerned with three questions, right? Three questions. What can I know? And he says, this is metaphysics. Now, this is not traditional metaphysics, and today we would call this epistemology, not metaphysics, okay? But what he's really wanting to do when he asks, what can I know, is what are the limits on human knowledge, right? On any and all human knowledge. Secondly, what ought I to do, right? What should I do? This is morality. And third, for what can I hope? For what can I hope? This is religion. And you'll notice, I think, the role of hope in Kant's Religion Within the Limits. And in all of these areas, Kant is engaged in a criticism and revision of rational theism. Now, I didn't make you read any of these except for the religion within the limits, but you didn't have to read the first critique, or the first critique was like 770 pages or something. And so one of his students asked him, well, why didn't you put any examples in so we could get it a little bit more? I said, well, that would have made it too long. It was already too long. In this book, The Critique of Pure Reason, he sets out some fundamental epistemological rules, that is, rules for that limits to our ability to know things and why we shouldn't transgress them. In The Critique of Practical Reason, he wants to know how pure reason can become practical. That is, how it can show us how to act. When he uses the term practical, he has in mind praxis, right? Practices that we actually do. And in so doing, he tries to salvage certain theological ideas by arguing that they are required by morality, if not by science, right? And this is what he would say about the categorical imperative, right? It's required by morality, but not by science or scientia or Wissenschaft. In The Religion Within the Limits, he wants to talk about the relationship between the religion of reason, this is what we mentioned over yonder, and concrete historical religions, okay? But notice, though, that for Kant, the question of knowledge comes first, right? The question of knowledge comes first. So, by the way, this portrait of Kant, does it kind of remind you of sometimes of people on Zoom? You know, because when you're on Zoom, a lot of times like your camera's over the top, but then the person that's talking is kind of down in the corner. But I don't think he was on Zoom. The question of knowledge comes first, right? And this is not accidental because Kant, just like Hume and just like Locke, thinks that epistemology must come first, right? Epistemology then, for Kant and for many in the modern period, is first philosophy, right? Now, Aristotle, remember, said that metaphysics, he didn't really use that word metaphysics, but he just used the word first philosophy and said it's the science of being qua being, right? But that's what Kant thinks is an illusion. So epistemology comes first for Kant. And his dominant philosophical concern is to vindicate the authority of reason. And so to do this, what he wants, yeah.
Sorry, can I just organize the thing? So we have the metaphysics, which is the great, broad, ontological statements of being. We have
Yes, but not for Kant, right?
Correct, but
Yeah.
just to subdivide right. Then the epistemology, which is knowledge, what we are able to have knowledge of, and then we can have, just in terms of the first philosophies, and then
Yes.
you can have the ethical as first philosophy, which would be the human interaction with one another is the first thing determining the other things. Just like I'm thinking of like Levinas and whatnot in terms of you really want ethics to be first philosophy. So if it is I know it and then I act it, like in terms of the practice, like what's that?
Yeah, okay, you can talk about it that way.
Okay,
You
got
can
it.
talk about it that way.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you.
But these people that we're sitting are not going to think, like for Kant, for example, you can't talk about morality as first philosophy.
No, because
Correct.
you have to
figure out
have
what you can know.
knowledge is the first- okay, got it.
Okay,
So-
good.
Cool.
So he wants to vindicate the authority of reason, and to do this, he wants to show, or he's trying to show that both our theoretical needs and our practical needs. And what I mean by that is theoretical needs are our needs about what we can know and what we can't know. Okay, our practical needs are needs that we have in terms of knowing how to act, right? How to engage in practice. If we can show that both of these are informed by the same kinds of principles, namely, principles that are both necessary and rationally discoverable. Yeah, sorry, Laura.
Theoretical needs are ones that we can know, is that what you said? I missed it.
That we need
Or that we need to know?
in order to know.
Oh, I see.
Okay,
Yeah.
in order to know things. Now, if he can show that those principles are both necessary and rationally discoverable, Then he's going to have an answer to Hume's empiricism and to Hume's skepticism. Remember, Kant made the famous statement that it was David Hume that awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. Right? For me, it's usually I have to go to the bathroom. But for Kant, it was for Kant, it was Hume. Sorry about that. I can't believe I said that when we were recording this, but
Oh, wow.
you know, I'm old. What can you do? So when Kant says that metaphysics provides the answer to what can I know, he's not talking about metaphysics as Aquinas understood the term. For Aquinas and there's no 20. This should be 26, I think. Yep. For Aquinas and for Leibniz, metaphysics meant the study of the structures of reality as such, right? Possibly even the mind of God, or being qua being, okay? But Kant says, he thinks that we don't have any access to that. We don't have any access to what God is like, or what nature is like in itself, or being qua being. He says we don't have any access to that. We only have access to things as they appear to us, right? As they appear to us. That's phenomena, right? Phenomenon, which is just a participle of the verb phino, right? To appear or to seem.
So how did he, so the thing that I clocked in here is that he actually did use scripture,
Yeah.
both in terms of defense and also in a fight. Like he actually entered into a scriptural conversation.
True, yeah.
How did he, what was his perspective on scripture and scripture's role within religion?
Well, we'll get to that, but scripture, he's going to, what he would say is that scripture, along with certain things that scripture talks about, for example, Corinthians, somewhere or another, that talks where Paul has the language about that we use in the Eucharist, right? He's going to say things like that are fine, they can be helpful, but they can also be harmful. So these are the kinds of things that he's trying to establish a positive use for, okay? But that really should not be rationally necessary, okay? So, in other words, he would say that scripture is not necessary for you to understand the moral law. Definitely wants to say that.
But also just, because like, you know, scripture at times makes very metaphysical claims in terms of us being, like, we have the mind of God.
Yeah, right, right.
And Jesus is,
Yes.
you know, the way that we are able to know the mind, stuff like that.
Right.
He would be like, no. Like, is that what he would be like?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's not going to say you can know the mind of God.
Yeah.
Yeah, no way. Like, you can't even know your own mind, right? Much less the mind of God.
Yeah.
Yeah, Laura.
So just to finish my notes, we started by saying, in order to answer Hume's, and then we went on.
Well, he'll have an answer to Hume's empiricism and skepticism if he can show those two principles, right? These principles that are both necessary and rationally discoverable.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure. So remember, all we have access to is things as they appear to us. And the reason is because of the fact that objects conform to our minds, right? Space and time are structures of our minds, okay? And we can't assume that reality, things as they are in themselves, are the same as they appear to us. Now, the phenomenal sphere does not exhaust everything that there is. We can know that there are things in themselves, so we can know that there is a God in God's self. But that's all we can say about God. That there is a God in God's self. We can't know anything more about the noumenal realm. Now, he says, if our theoretical knowledge is limited to things as they appear, then we must begin with epistemology, right? With what can I know? And the way to approach that is, he says, is to begin transcendentally. Now, when we say transcendentally, you know, we're not talking about, like, remember there was a thing for a while, transcendental meditation? Remember like TM? I think there's even a court case about that where somebody was teaching that in a public school. Okay, well, is that a religion, you know, et cetera? We're not talking about that. I'm also not talking about just trying to understand things that we might consider to be transcendent, okay? A transcendental argument or a transcendental investigation is when you try to discover the conditions of the possibility of whatever it is you're trying to study, right? So, for example, if you want to know what human subjectivity is all about and what it needs, what you're going to have to do is to figure out the conditions of the possibility of any and all acts of human subjectivity. That is, any and all acts of thinking or knowledge, okay? And these are going to be the categories that I passed out of the table of categories, right? Those are the conditions of the possibility of thinking about things, okay? That is, you use things like number, quantity, right? Extension, etc., okay? And so what we want to show what must be the case for us to know or experience anything at all. And this is what Kant calls metaphysics, right? It's this transcendental enterprise. So for Kant, metaphysics is the study of our own consciousness, the study of our own consciousness, and more specifically, the study of the conditions of the possibility of our knowing and our experiencing. Now, as we've all said several times before, this is different than metaphysics as it was known before Kant. So if someone uses the term metaphysics, usually now people will mean pre-Kantian type of metaphysics, but not always. And it's good to know whether they're using it in this Kantian fashion or in a sort of pre-Kantian fashion. Okay, now's a good time for a break, I think, because what's going to come up next, I'm going to mention some things on this handout on Kant, on theology and religion. Okay, so anyway, I ask a question or anything before we go to the break? And then, should we record the break? No. Allison and Addison, I'm sorry, but we're going to talk about you guys over the break, so we're going to cut this off for a little bit, okay?